did it. Kirk showed up.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And, of course, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus, $250 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So if you do not know me, I am your very humble host that cannot tell the difference between $200 and $250. Also known as Aaron Freeman, also known as Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a long time, almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and you will get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So on today's Locked On Falcons podcast, we're going to be talking about some nose tackles that could and should be on the Falcons' radar. Talking about, could we see all 4 NFC South teams walk away from round 1 this year with an edge rusher? But of course, we got to start the day talking about the topic du jour. And whenever Kirk Cousins sneezes, the NFL world turns and says, hey, what's up Kirk up to? And you guys know I love talking about Kirk Cousins. It's my favorite thing. It makes my teeth white. Okay? And the Falcons started offseason activities today, Tuesday, April 22nd. And Raheem Morris, back at the owners' meeting at the beginning of the month, said, I don't think Kirk Cousins is going to show up for these voluntary workouts, which prompted the Falcons to add a 4th quarterback to their roster yesterday in Easton Stick so that they would have 3 working arms in these first phase of offseason activities with Stick, Penix, and Jones. But then Kirk Cousins showed up, according to Zach Klein, and then confirmed by a friend of the podcast, Maria Martin, to this voluntary portion of the offseason. He doesn't have to be there, but he decided out of the goodness of his heart to show up to voluntary workouts because Kirk is just good guy Kirk. Okay? Saving puppies, right? Just like Bijan Robinson. Like Bijan Robinson is rescuing puppies out of burning buildings, and Kirk is just there to cradle them because Kirk is such a good guy. Now, of course, this is a big deal because, again, Raheem Morris said at the owners' meeting, I don't expect Kirk to show up for voluntary workouts. And everybody's like, we didn't think Kirk would show up for voluntary workouts, right? You don't have to show up for voluntary. That's why voluntary means, right? You know, every offseason we get a big to-do about who's showing up for voluntary workouts. And it's usually involving somebody with a contract dispute and being like, I want some more money. I'm going to skip voluntary workouts. But the real question is, if you're going to skip voluntary workouts, what are you going to do when mandatory workouts come on? Because then if you don't show up for mandatory, you get fined, right? And that's a real problem. And that's really when you can put your foot down. But of course, if Kirk is willing to show up at voluntary, because the question was, it was like, oh, he'll skip the voluntary. And then the question will be, will he or won't they trade him between now and the start of mandatory, which will be on June 10th and 11th. And now that question is pretty much it. Kirk's going to show up for voluntary workouts. And so presumably, like, it'll be weird to show up at voluntary and not show up at mandatory. So I guess we have the answer to that question. So I guess we won't have to do a podcast that time in early June talking about Kirk Cousins. Is he going to show up? So we'll see. Now, of course, you're wondering, okay, Aaron, no one cares that Kirk is out here rescuing puppies and showing up for voluntary workouts. What does this mean for the Kirk Cousins trade saga? And it means nothing. Doesn't mean anything, whether Kirk shows up or not. It wouldn't have mattered to the trade saga because, we're still at the will they, won't they trade Kirk Cousins, but whether he's at voluntary workouts doesn't matter. All right, we're just really waiting on what the Steelers do because that's really the one team that we're still hoping that has a slim chance, it's a chance to trade for Kirk Cousins after the draft, right? We got to wait to see how the chips fall this weekend, right? What happens with the Steelers and their draft plans? everybody expects the Steelers to draft a quarterback. It's just a question of when are they going to draft a quarterback? Is it going to be round 1, right? Because we know Kirk ain't going to waive his no trade clause to go to a team that uses a first round pick on a quarterback, because he knows there's a ticking clock on how long he's going to have that starting job. And Kirk, because he's such a good guy, he just wants to be comfortable. You can't sue a guy for just wanting to be comfortable, not wanting to look over his shoulder to see if that Quitsats Hatterack is staring him in the face. But I think there's been a lot of speculation as of late that, let's talk about the Steelers. Let's be Locked On Steelers. Again, Chris Carter, Locked On Steelers, is going to give you a little bit more in depth. But I'm going to give you my take on all the things going on in Pittsburgh based off of the whispers I hear. Right? There's a lot of speculation. Shedeur Sanders is going to fall out the top 10, the Colorado quarterback. And a lot of people are expecting the Steelers to snatch him up if he falls all the way to 21. I've seen enough smoke to say that I don't think that's likely. That's a possibility. It's going to be the prevailing storyline come Thursday night, should Shedeur Sanders fall. And it seems likely at this point in time that Shedeur will fall out the top 10. But I've seen enough buzz that says the Steelers aren't in love with Shedeur enough to take him at 21, right? They've been down that path where taking Kenny Pickett. And I know, it's debatable where does Shedeur fit in the Kenny Pickett paradigm, all that stuff. But we talked about Jonathan Jones of CBS Sports and his mock having the Falcons taking James Pierce Jr. Yesterday, he had Shedeur falling out of the first round in his mock draft. So worth noting. And the overwhelming buzz I've heard from people that cover the Steelers is that the Steelers are likely to go D-line at 21. Someone like a Derek Harmon makes a ton of sense for them. And wait on a quarterback. And the Steelers don't have a second round pick. And so that means maybe they'll be waiting all the way to round 3 to get that quarterback and see who's there. Is that going to be Jalen Milroe? Is that going to be Tyler Shuck? Is that going to be Will Howard or somebody else like that? So I don't know if the draft, given Pittsburgh's situation, is going to really impact the trade situation. Obviously, if the Steelers do pass on a quarterback in round 1, it leaves the door, I won't say wide open, but certainly open for a trade with Kirk Cousins to happen, right? But the real issue with the Pittsburgh Steelers specifically is Aaron Rodgers. It's the Aaron Rodgers-sized elephant in the room, right? That the Steelers GM earlier today said that they plan on adding 2 quarterbacks between now and the start of training camp. And if we're going to assume one of those is going to be this weekend in the draft, the other one presumably will be a veteran player. And that theoretically could boil down between Kirk Cousins or Aaron Rodgers. And given reports that, Aaron Rodgers publicly has already said that he'd be willing to play for, money is not an object when it comes to his future decision. And he'd be willing to play for $10 million. And yesterday we spent quite a bit of time talking about how the Falcons are reportedly asking teams as part of a potential Kirk Cousins trade package to pay off, at least $20 million of Kirk's remaining guaranteed money. That feels like it's an either or. It feels like there's an obvious choice that you would go with. But Aaron Rodgers could continue to drag his feet after the draft. And the Steelers could get pissy. We know their offensive coordinator has a tendency to get pissy. Ask Marcus Mariota on that one. And pivot off of Aaron Rodgers. And that's definitely a possibility. That feels pretty plausible. Rather than a slim chance, that feels likely that the Steelers might pivot off of Kirk Cousins or off of Aaron Rodgers. And so at that point, the question is going to be, are the Falcons and the Steelers going to come to an accord, right? Meet in the middle, so to speak, have a compromise, right? If the Falcons are saying you gotta take $20 million of the Kirk Cousins, and the Steelers are saying, hypothetically, has been reported by people or speculated, as far as other people have said, well, we're only willing to pay Kirk $10 million, which is seemingly the going rate for a quarterback of Kirk's age and ability this offseason. Then there's a happy compromise in the middle. It's like $15 million. Oh, everybody's happy. Bob's your uncle, all that sort of stuff. So we'll see. So I sit there going back, reiterating the point I made on yesterday's episode that the Falcons can continue to play hardball up until the draft because they know a trade is not going to happen but before the draft because of Kirk's no trade clause, and he's not going to waive his no trade clause because he's worried about, the Dukes of Arrakis staring from behind him. And if you don't understand that reference, then how dare you consider yourself an everydayer? Okay. But after the draft, I do think the Falcons cannot continue to have that hard line in the sand. Well, you got to take $20 million. It doesn't make any sense to me, but we won't get into that on today's episode. So, who knows? Falcons said they're very comfortable with Kirk being their backup. And if they don't, in my opinion, adjust their stance, that hardline stance on how much money they're willing to take on in a Kirk Cousins trade, then he will remain their backup. So we will continue to talk about Kirk Cousins and his availability at future off-season events for the Atlanta Falcons. So we will see what's what with Kirk after the draft. But what's going to be interesting in this draft is the possibility that all 4 NFC South teams may walk away from the draft with an edge rusher. And what could that mean for this division moving forward? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So the NBA playoffs are here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action, because right now when you join FanDuel, place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. Now, I know for many of you Hawks fans out there, it's too soon. You're still, lamenting the Hawks not being in the playoffs. And so if you need some time to circle back to the NBA playoffs and head over to FanDuel, you can still head on over to FanDuel right now and get in on this NFL draft action. Where, you've been doing your mock drafts, you've been projecting picks. Why not put your money where your mouth is and win some money off who you think's going to go where? And then with the Falcons' first-round pick, again, the FanDuel odds overwhelmingly say it's going to be a defensive lineman or edge rusher. You can bet on what position they're going to play. But, hey, I couldn't help but notice those 7-1 odds for an offensive lineman. And even though we all will collectively crash out if the Atlanta Falcons have the audacity to not take an edge rusher in round 1, our crash out will just be a little bit less if we can make a little bit of money off it. So don't miss out by heading over to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today. So sitting here wondering, reading some of all these rumors and all that stuff, wouldn't it be interesting if all 4 NFC South teams wound up walking away from this draft class with an edge rusher? Right? Carolina picking 8th overall, right? We discussed previously on the pod. The overwhelming majority of people think that they will take Georgia linebacker, edge rusher, Jalen Walker, right? If you like Jalen Walker, you see him as a hybrid, versatile player. If you don't like Jalen Walker, and I happen to be in the camp that doesn't necessarily love Jalen Walker, you see him as a tweener, right? But let's assume for the sake of today that the consensus is right and that the Panthers see him as that hybrid, versatile, next Micah Parsons type player, and they take him at the 8th overall selection. Then you have the New Orleans Saints picking at 9. There's lots of talk about them potentially taking pass rusher. And I've seen various rumors that seem to suggest that, if they were to pull the trigger on a pass rusher at that 9th overall spot, it could be Jalen Walker's Georgia teammate, Mykel Williams, at that spot. But we'll see. Now, I think of the 4 teams in the NFC South, the Saints are probably the least likely to pull the trigger on the edge rusher in round 1, right? They just paid Carl Granderson last year. They paid Chase Young this past offseason. Cam Jordan still on the team. Drafting edge rushers hasn't quite worked out for them in recent years because 2nd-round pick from 23, Isaiah Foskey, and 1st-round pick from 22, 21, wherever, Peyton Turner didn't quite work out. But, if the Saints don't go edge in round 1, maybe they could swing back with like 9 picks or something like that and take advantage of the depth of this edge class a little bit later. But let's say for the sake of argument, they go edge in round 1. Then, of course, you have the Atlanta Falcons at 15. We'll circle back to that. But looking ahead to the Tampa Bay Bucks at 19, right? I mentioned before, there's a lot of buzz that the Bucks like Donovan Ezeraku from Boston College. Now, do the Bucks need an edge rusher? Not particularly. Right? They signed Hassan Reddick this offseason. They already have Yaya Diaby. They drafted Chris Braswell last year. But, Reddick is on a 1-year deal. He's a 31-year-old player. In all likelihood, you're moving on from Hassan Reddick, and finding that second edge rusher has been a significant need for the Bucks for a number of years. That's why they drafted Joe Tryon-Shoyinka and so many other players over the last couple of years. And so that player could be Donovan Ezeraku, right? And I don't think Ezeraku has the same juice that Hassan Reddick has in terms of his speed off the edge, but they're similar players. And so he would be a natural player to draft and stash for a year before, he could blossom. That's the benefit of actually winning your division, that you don't necessarily need to go out there and get an instant impact player like the team that's picking 15th overall like the Atlanta Falcons, where they can't afford to stash that player. I'm looking at you, Terry. Don't do it. Don't do it with the offensive tackle. But, we know with 100% certainty that the Atlanta Falcons are definitely taking an edge rusher with their first round pick at 15, because, drafting anybody else would be absolutely ridiculous. Okay. It would make my life miserable. Although, looking at those FanDuel sportsbook odds, it's like, it might be, I'll be miserable, but rich, right? So we'll see. If you're going to be miserable, at least be rich, right? Capitalism, baby. So, as we discussed yesterday, James Pierce Jr. is getting some recent buzz from various NFL insiders, the Tennessee pass rusher. Of course, various NFL insiders continue to connect the Falcons to Mike Green of Marshall. Right. I still hear buzz, not as much buzz in the last 48 hours. Because again, it's just always about what's the most recent rumor that people tend to be buzzing about. But, there's still people thinking, hey, Michael Williams could be an option for the Falcons as well. I've talked about Donovan Nezaraku being an option. So we shall see what the Falcons wind up doing. But hypothetically, just for the sake of today's episode, let's say Carolina goes Jalen Walker, New Orleans goes Michael Williams, Atlanta goes Mike Green or James Pierce Jr. Doesn't really matter. Whichever makes you happier, close your eyes and picture whichever one makes you happy. And Tampa Bay goes Donovan Ezerako. And if that is the case, like, the odds are that at least one of those four guys is going to hit and be a major thorn in the side of the other three NFC South teams for, a decade or more. And the odds are that at least one of those guys is going to be a complete bust, and we're just going to be laughing at that team. And so to me, it's just, I'm not here to make any predictions or anything, guys, but I'm just saying it's an interesting conversation to have. Like, who's that guy going to be? I have no idea. I just think it's very interesting to think about. And it's just similar because you've seen this trend the last couple of years in the NFC South. Going back to 2023, we had four brand new starting quarterbacks in the division: Bryce Young, Derek Carr, Desmond Ridder, Baker Mayfield. You go to last year, we had four brand new offensive play callers in the NFC South: David Canales, Clint Kubiak, Zach Robinson, Liam Cohen. Now, when you ask the question of which one's hit, it's always the Bucs, right? They've been the team that their new guy always winds up hitting, right? Whether it's Baker Mayfield, whether it's Liam Cohen, when it comes to the play caller and the quarterback. So hopefully that trend will end soon. Hopefully the Falcons will be the team that we will be saying, hey, Zach Robinson, hey, Michael Penix, not Desmond Ridder. Hey, Mike Green, James Pierce Jr., whoever you're picturing the Falcons taking. Hopefully that trend will end soon. So it's just some food for thought, something to keep an eye on. So it's always worth noting to me to kind of pay attention to some of the trends going on elsewhere in the division. And it just feels like the NFC South tends to have this, thing where they're all kind of like-minded individuals and whatnot. And so just interesting to see what they do that makes some teams successful and other teams unsuccessful. So we will shift from the pass rushers and edge rushers to some run pluggers in the middle of the defensive line, because I've watched some of the top nose tackles and I have some thoughts. Now, have you ever thought of turning your TV into an Xbox? Because you can do so with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe or sign into your Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to go. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 as easily as you stream your favorite shows. It's gaming made simple, and it's all on your Fire TV. And, speaking of easily streaming your favorite shows, with that 4K streaming, you can watch more than 1.5 million movies or TV shows of your favorite, right? Subscribe services from Netflix, Prime Video, Disney Plus, Max, and more. So if you're a hardcore gamer, casual gamer, or you don't care about video games at all, Fire TV has got you covered. So head on over to Amazon.com/Fire TV Locked On to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices, including Fire TV Stick 4K 2nd Gen, Fire TV Stick 4K Max 1st and 2nd Gen, and Fire TV Cube 3rd Gen. So for the Locked On Falcons Insiders, I'm in the process of putting together a breakdown of 4 defensive tackles, nose tackles to be specific: Jamaree Caldwell of Oregon, Alfred Collins of Texas, Cameron Jackson of Florida, and Tyleik Williams of Ohio State, part of my pre-draft series of videos breaking down some of the top defensive prospects in this 2025 draft class. These 4 guys will push that number to 34 different prospects. I also looked at Kenneth Grant, the Michigan nose tackle, earlier this offseason. 11 edge rushers, 9 interior D linemen, 11 corners, 3 safeties, no linebackers. So, of course, the Falcons will go offensive tackle, linebacker, tight end or center with their first couple of picks, and all this work would have been done for nothing. Just my luck with the Atlanta Falcons. 34 prospects, they won't draft a single one of them, right? Odds are like I can't even get a 3% hit rate. Just get one in the building. But if you want to check out that video breakdown, which should probably be available within 24 hours of you listening to or watching this podcast, you can check it out at the link in the description below, as well as those other breakdowns. And not only do you get those breakdowns, you get my live reaction to whoever the Falcons are going to pick, probably before anybody else gets them. And then post-draft, when the Falcons make their picks, we'll do some film breakdowns of various prospects. And like last summer, when we were doing that, you were getting those video breakdowns at least a week before we would do the full in-depth deep dive here on the podcast. So that is a reason to sign up and become a Locked On Falcons Insider. It's a 14-day free trial. Then it's $4.99 a month after that point. So check it out. But let's talk about nose tackles. It is a position of need for the Atlanta Falcons, regardless of whether the Falcons are a 4-3 or 3-4. They need someone who can play that 1-tech, 0-tech, and plug the middle of their defense. They lost Eddie Goldman, who was the primary player in that role last year. His backup, Kentavious Street, has returned, but as we discussed throughout last season, Kentavious Street is not a natural fit as a nose tackle. That is a poor fit for him, and it was a big reason why the Falcons couldn't stop the run when Kentavious Street often found himself on the football field last year. And so if the season started tomorrow, it would be Kentavious Street and LaCale London as their nose tackles. Now, I know a lot of people are like, what about David Onyemata? And for the umpteenth time in the last 2 years, David Onyemata is not a nose tackle. He played one season in 2019 with the New Orleans Saints, dabbling as a nose tackle. It was one of his least productive seasons that he had in New Orleans. It's not a coincidence. He is not a nose tackle. He's a 3-tech. Okay, so the Falcons need to go out there and find another wide body. And they had ample opportunity to find that guy in free agency. They chose to not do so, as they so often have chosen not to do anything in free agency this offseason. And I'm not still butthurt about it. No, not at all. My therapist is not still talking to me about that stuff. But because they did not do that in free agency, guys, they need a plug-and-play starter in the draft. And the great thing about this 2025 draft class is that there's a lot of good nose tackles available. It's part of a really deep edge class, a really deep interior D-line class, right? You can get a 3-tech, you can get a 1-tech, you can get a 5-tech, you can get a 6 or 7-tech, right? If you don't know the techniques, 7-tech is the edge rusher, 5-tech is lined up over the tackle. No, you get the gist. 1-tech is lined up over center, and 3-tech is shaded over the guard. So different positions for those of you that don't know. So, you got round 1, Kenneth Grant of Michigan. He's 23rd on Arif Hassan's consensus draft board. Alfred Collins and Tyleik Williams in round 2. Williams is 41. Collins is 60. Right. You got the 3rd, 4th round range. All right. CJ West out of Indiana, really good pass rusher for a nose tackle at 108 on the consensus draft board. Caldwell's 116. You got Jackson at 159. Right, that's more maybe 5th round range. But then you get into the late rounds. You got our guy Nazir Stackhouse from the University of Georgia at 223, Jay Toya of UCLA 252, Cam Horsley of Boston College 255, and Zeke Biggers of Georgia Tech at 276. And I'm sure there are other guys that we could rattle off, but those are some of the guys that are out there. And part of my hopes for this draft class, guys, is the Falcons definitely go edge in round 1. Then they swing back in round 2, get a corner. And then in round 4, potentially get that nose tackle. And that's where I think guys like Caldwell and Jackson should potentially be available. But as I've said before, and as we know with the Falcons, they're going to zig when you expect them to zag. And, because it's like, oh, you can wait on a nose tackle till round 4, they're going to be like, nope, we're prioritizing that in round 2. Because, again, we want to show that we're really invested in our defensive front. And, what better than prioritizing a team that has arguably the NFL's worst pass rush by using a premium draft pick on a 2-down player like a nose tackle. So, but despite my issues, if they did wind up drafting Alfred Collins, I wouldn't be mad about it, right? Because he might be the best run stopper in this draft, right? Cam Jackson, I don't think is far behind. I talked a bunch about Cam Jackson during Senior Bowl week. You can go check out those episodes. But the problem with those two specific guys of this quartet that we're talking about is they don't really bring anything as a pass rusher. At least with like Caldwell and Tyleik Williams, it's like they're not great pass rushers, but it's like there's a little something there. So they're not a complete waste on third downs. Like Collins and Jackson, like, it's passing situation, get off the field, my guys. But, there may be some developmental upside for them. But, we're talking about guys that probably in their best years as pass rushers, when we're talking about Collins and Jackson, are, going to get you 1 or 2 cleanup sacks and maybe 15, maybe 20 pressures in a season, which is, for the Falcons, we're not scoffing at that. We will take all that we can get. But, for most NFL teams, normal NFL teams that aren't pass rush deprived, they're looking at that and like, all right, like that ain't nothing. But, what's interesting with Collins in particular is he's dealing with a leg injury. He was spotted at Texas's pro day last month with a walking boot. Reports say it's just a calf sprain. But then I saw a report from Brian Broaddus, who covers the Cowboys. He went on the radio or a podcast the other day and talked about how an injury to Collins, as well as Derek Harmon, the Oregon defensive tackle, could cause both of those guys to slip down the board. So he didn't disclose what the injury was, but that's something to keep an eye on. And I bring that up because in a world where the Falcons do go for that nose tackle in round 2, and if Collins is their man, and it makes a ton of sense that Collins would be their guy because he's a really good run plugger, and my man has pterodactyl wings for arms. Just ask the Georgia fans, that first Georgia game, he's just completely tossing guards and centers aside and just like reaching out with his pterodactyl arms and just snatching ball carriers and whatnot in that game. But he makes a ton of sense. But if they like Collins, and everything tells me that he's the type of guy that the Falcons would love, it feels like greater probability than there is with Tyleik Williams being there at pick 46, right? Given that, Williams is 41 on the consensus board, Collins is 60. And if he's going to slide a little bit because of this injury, right, maybe you can move back and still get him, right? You don't have to stick and pick at 46. You can move back. And in a world where the Falcons don't trade back in round 1, maybe you get that trade back in round 2 to add more, assets in this draft, which is much needed for the Falcons to address all their issues on the team. And given that Collins is already considered a late second round pick on the consensus board, that injury thing is true. Maybe he slides all the way to round 3, depending on what happens. So, it's the idea of having your cake and eating it too. And we had a similar conversation when we talked about James Pierce yesterday, that if you're eyeing James Pierce as your first round pick, he seems to be, based off of all that we've heard, he's the guy that you have probably the greater probability of being able to move back in round 1 and still be able to land as that edge rusher compared to some of the other guys that we were talking about earlier in today's episode, as well as yesterday's episode. And, we're just trying to be positive for once on this podcast, guys, trying to have a hopeful scenario for the Atlanta Falcons where they not only can move back, let's say a couple of spots in round 1, pick up a third round pick, still land a player like James Pierce Jr., and be that edge rusher. And then, round 2 rolls around and they're like, hey, we want to continue to address the front, but we're going to move back a couple of spots, pick up a 4th round pick, boom, and we're still going to be able to land Alfred Collins, arguably the best run defender in the entire draft class. And then now all of a sudden you have that flexibility, right? That round 3 pick that you picked up, maybe you go after a cornerback like Jacob Parrish at a K-State, and then you use one of those 2 4th round picks that you now have on an offensive tackle that this team so desperately wants and needs, right? And then maybe with that other 4th round pick, you double dip on an edge rusher, right? Just in case you're a little worried about all the red flags surrounding James Pierce Jr. You're like, hey, let's get 2. Let's get 2. Utah, give me 2, right? Or, maybe you pass on the edge, you go center, right? Bring in that competition against Ryan Nuzzo. And then, of course, in round 7, you got to get your Georgia guys. Haven't gotten the Georgia guy yet, right? Because, I don't think Jared Wilson's going to be there in round 4. But then you come back in round 7, you get Dan Jackson, the safety out of Georgia. You get Ben Urasek, the tight end out of Georgia, or Chaz Chambliss. There's your double dip edge in round 7, right? We can't get Nazir Stackhouse, who we've been all circling, like, oh, that's your nose tackle. Wait till round 7, get Nazir Stackhouse, or get Warren Brinson in round 7. No, but the Falcons did that once with Zion Logan, and it burned him. So they're going to get that nose tackle a little bit earlier. So, if they get Collins in round 2, then you don't need Nazir Stackhouse in round 7. Double dipping on nose tackle, so crazy it just might work. That's what Terry Fonzo was thinking, but we'll see. We're just spitballing here on the podcast, trying to have a different conversation. more positive conversation about the Atlanta Falcons. And maybe if the Falcons were able to pull all this off, we'd be sitting here on Friday, Saturday, Sunday saying positive things about Terry Falcons. I'm like, Terry, are you cooking something in there? It smells pretty good. So we will see if the Falcons can pull that off. Tomorrow we will see what Jarvis Davis thinks about all these latest rumors. And he will join us on tomorrow's show. I don't think that will be our last pre-draft show, but we'll probably I'm leaning towards doing some live show Thursday afternoon, evening, just before the draft to talk about the latest happenings. And then, of course, we'll have all your reaction shows and whatnot to whatever the Falcons do. Is it going to be an epic crash out? Who knows? Or will I be sitting here and be like, Terry, what you cooking in there? So make sure you check out Locked On Falcons and continue to make us your first listen so you do not miss whatever drama is going to, again, I don't know what's going to happen, guys, but we know it's going to be tremendous content. So check us out by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, as well as the Locked On NFL Mock Draft on the Locked On NFL Draft podcast feed. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.